Okay, what's up, everybody? Welcome back to the third part of these lectures now for Reformed Presbyterian Theological Seminary. This is PT11 Spiritual Development, talking on behalf of Dr. David Whitless' class. My name is Matthew Everhard. I'm the pastor of Gospel Fellowship PCA, and you probably already know this, but this is the third of three lectures on the spiritual development of Jonathan Edwards. In the first lecture, I attempted to give an overview of Edwards' life and his influence unto today, some of the things that he is notable for. In the second lecture, we began to narrow down the scope to what I called his personal theological project. And I mentioned that most of the theological project took place, or at least was begun, in the early pastoral years of 1722 to 1726. And amongst the personal theological project, we mentioned the resolutions, the diary, the miscellanies, the notebooks, and the blank Bible. In this third lecture, we're going to focus almost exclusively now on the first elements of that personal theological project, which is his 70 resolutions. And so let's go ahead and begin now as we narrow down and begin talking about them. Let me give you an example of a couple resolutions just off the bat so you can understand what it is we're talking about here. What is a resolution? Well, each of the 70 resolutions are usually just about 1 or 2 sentences long at the most. They are short, they are punctiliar, they are directive thoughts, goals, or guidelines for Edwards' life. Usually, in almost every case, they begin with the word resolved, which is why we call them the resolutions, because Edwards is making a promise, an oath, or a vow to himself to live in a particular way. So let's look at 2 of my favorite ones, and then we'll begin to break down what Edwards is doing overall in the resolution. So number 6. Resolved to live with all my might while I do live. I love that one. I have it memorized, and it's kind of become one of my own personal resolutions. I think about the brevity of life, the meaning of life, the purpose to live for the glory of God, and I find that to be a pretty inspiring thought. Here's the second one, Resolution 22. Resolved to endeavor to obtain for myself as much happiness in the other world as I possibly can, with all the power, might, vigor, and vehemence, yea, violence, and he doesn't mean physical violence there, he means just a striving of the soul, that I am capable of or can bring myself to exert in any way that can be thought of. So clearly you get the idea that this 19-year-old young man, almost 20 years old, is really striving after a life that pleases God, to serve him with heart, mind, soul, and strength, as Jesus says in the greatest commandment. Well, I know I've mentioned this before, and if you didn't watch lecture 1, then maybe this is going to be new to you. If you did watch lecture 1, I'm going to go over this very quick. But I need to mention again the early pastoral years of 1722 to 1726, because this is the era of Edwards' life in which he wrote the resolutions. So real quick, let's just do some dates here. 1720 is the date that he gets his bachelor's degree from Yale University. In 1721, he experiences a profound conversion, and although he disagrees with his father about the timing and the steps required in conversion, yet Edwards himself pins his conversion experience to that year as he meditates on 1 Timothy 1:17. In 1722, we have a key era in Edwards' life. It's a brief stint as the Presbyterian pastor of a small splinter group congregation in New York City. And this is, by many accounts, the high point of Edwards' spiritual experiences as he's growing in faith as a young Christian. He would often point back to his time in New York City as sort of an idyllic, ideal period of growth, faithfulness, joy, and pursuit of holiness. He comes home 1723. He has a brief stint in a congregation in Bolton, Connecticut. It does not go well for various reasons. In 1724, he becomes a tutor at Yale after he's acquired his master's degree, which is essentially part teacher, part hall monitor. Pretty difficult job, to be honest. And then in 1726, he's called as the associate pastor under his grandfather, Solomon Stoddard. All of those events I call the early pastoral years of Edwards, and it's in these 2 years of 1722 and 1723 that the resolutions are begun. Now let's talk a little bit about the resolutions as a document. First of all, we have to say, and I've mentioned this in a prior lecture as well, that unfortunately the original handwritten document of the resolutions has been lost. We don't have it anymore. Perhaps it wore out, perhaps it was misplaced. We do know that Edwards had 2 early biographers, Hopkins and Dwight, who wrote the lives of earliest biographies of Jonathan Edwards and did some work to distill some of his earlier writings, to get some of the things that weren't in print into print. Samuel Hopkins was one of Edwards's best students in the old log college mentoring young men kind of a way. And Sereno Dwight was one of his descendants. Both of these men apparently had access to the original handwritten resolutions, but one of the 2 of them should be blamed for having lost them to antiquity, so we don't have them anymore. Now what's interesting is both Sereno Dwight and Samuel Hopkins published lists of the 70 resolutions, but what's strange about it is that their lists tend to vary slightly from one another. So one of the 2 probably messed up in a couple of places, possibly both of them. And so the critical text of the resolutions is somewhat of a combined effort between the documentary evidence left behind by Hopkins and Dwight. If you were to read them, the resolutions in volume 16 of the collected works of Jonathan Edwards, the official Yale editions, it's sort of a critical text between the 2, and sometimes they have brackets to differentiate the versions of Hopkins from Dwight. But for the most part, these variations are really minor. Some of them have to do with the dating of the resolutions, and for the most part, we're pretty sure that we have what Edwards wrote as his 70 resolutions. Now, this is a little bit of a departure from many of Edwards's other works, because plenty of Edwards's actual handwritten works are still extant, and most of those are contained at the Beinecke Rare Manuscript Library at Yale University. So there's a ton of stuff that we have from Edwards's own hand. And so this is quite unlike, very ancient documents where we have no idea what the original autographs were like. We do have scores and scores of documents from Jonathan Edwards in his own handwriting, including things like Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, his miscellanies, most of his notebooks, dozens and dozens of his sermons. But the resolutions is a little bit unusual in that we don't have the original. So that's a little bit sad. Now, as one of his earlier biographers, I can't remember if it's Hopkins or Dwight, mentions, it seems as though from the original that is now lost, that Edwards wrote the first 30 or 35 or so resolutions at one sitting. And the early biographer notes this because they were all written in the same handwriting and in the same ink. And not to get too technical here, but it's pretty interesting. Some of the Edwardsian scholars really get into handwriting and ink coloration and composition, because we can actually begin to date some of Edwards's works that are not dated in his own handwriting. Based on the handwriting that he uses at the time, his script does change over time and for various purposes. Sometimes he writes very flowery, sometimes he writes very small. And because he did not use your standard Bic pen, but had to dip his feather into the inkwell, we can sometimes even figure out what period Edwards wrote based on what color or composition of the ink there is. And so the early biographer suggests that it's pretty clear from the original that the first 30 to 35 were written all in one sitting. And that does seem to make sense, as they are not dated as many of the other resolutions have a date affixed to them. And so he began, as far as we know, on December 18th of 1722, towards the end of that year. He's 19 years old, and he carried on the process of writing these resolutions until he had exactly 70 resolutions, at which point he aborts the project on August something of 1723. Don't have that date for you, but August of 1723 is when he concludes writing the resolutions. And towards the end of this lecture, we're going to ask the question why he stopped writing the resolutions. Maybe he just filled out his canon of vows and promises to himself. But I'm going to suggest there might have been another reason why he moved away from this project of making resolutions and keeping tabs on his own life. Now, some of these resolutions are pretty interesting because they do have a particular date affixed to either the making of the resolution or, in some cases, his reviewing of that resolution. And what's really interesting there, of course, is that we can move straight over to his diary and we can look up those dates. And to the best that we're able, we can discern and try to figure out exactly what Edwards was thinking on the day that he wrote the resolution. So in some cases, this is incredibly insightful and helpful because we maybe get a biographical hint as to what's going on in Edwards' life, why he would resolve to do or say or enact a certain principle in his life. But other times, they just seem to be things that he draws out of his own mind, his own heart, his own spiritual experiences, and he writes them down as a goal to himself. Now, I just held up this book a minute ago here. This is volume 16 of the official Yale Edwards editions, and pretty much most of the things that I'm going to talk about today in this video are contained in this volume. So volume 16 is the personal writings of Jonathan Edwards. It contains many, many letters of Edwards and then a few other additional documents, including the resolutions, the diary, the apostrophe to Sarah Pierpont, his fiancée become spouse, his wife, and then his personal narrative, which is kind of a self-evaluation of his own conversion and calling that Edwards writes as a more mature minister later on. I've been doing a lot of Edwards research myself in the past year, and much of my study has come from volume 16, so I would commend it to you. And by the way, I mentioned this in a previous video as well, that practically everything Edwards ever wrote is for free online on the internet at the Jonathan Edwards Center at Yale, and the web address for that is edwards.yale.edu. And if you watched lecture 1, I actually messed up the website there. So either way, I'll post it in the descriptions of these videos, and you can find all of Edwards' content, including the stuff we're talking about from volume 16. Now, I should mention too that the resolutions have found their way into prints in various other formats throughout the generations. Here's one, just a small little paperback that contains the resolutions and one other document of Jonathan Edwards. But once Dwight and Hopkins printed the resolutions, they actually got pretty popular pretty quick, and they began to be reprinted in various forms in all sorts of church, pious and devotional literature and materials, included in it with other things as versions of conversion stories. Sometimes they were reprinted in various periodicals, and so the resolutions got pretty popular pretty quick soon after Edwards' death as they came into publication. Many generations have found that the resolutions are quite inspiring, and I think you'll agree with me that that is certainly true as you begin to read through the 70 resolutions yourself. Sometimes people ask me if I was going to read one thing from Jonathan Edwards, what should I read? And very often I suggest the resolutions because they're so short and they're so brief, and you can read them from practically any level of comprehension. You don't necessarily need to be an Edwards scholar. You can read them in probably 15 minutes or so, and then you can say you've read something from Jonathan Edwards. So certainly no reason why you couldn't read the whole thing. All right, so a little bit of a backdrop here. There was a literary genre of the resolution that Edwards is stepping into here as he begins the process of writing his resolutions at age 19. It's not as though Edwards invents the concept of writing resolutions as though this were some sort of idea that he just drew out of his mind to make resolutions for himself. But apparently in this period, and we're talking the early 1700s, many other people had begun doing the same or a similar thing. And I want to mention two people in particular that also wrote resolutions that we might find to be interesting by way of comparison. So the first of the two would be Benjamin Franklin himself. Now, Benjamin Franklin wrote 13 resolutions, and we're going to have a look at some of them here in just a moment. Most of Franklin's resolutions have to do with virtue or living a good life publicly, a good civic life, a moral life, Of course, Ben Franklin is an interesting character in his own right. Franklin has, and I say this by way of parenthesis, a very interesting relationship with George Whitefield, the great revivalist preacher of the day. Franklin and Whitefield seem to have an interesting relationship, although spiritually they wouldn't have agreed on much. Franklin is the furthest thing from what we might call an evangelical Christian. And so we can discern then that it wasn't just Christians who wrote these resolutions for themselves, but many people in public office or people that wanted to aspire to a certain kind of life might write resolutions. So Franklin wrote 13. George Washington, the first president of the United States, one of our great generals from our history, he also wrote resolutions. He had 110 of them. And it seems as though Washington's resolutions were not necessarily drawn from his own head, but he actually seems to have copied them out of some sort of other book, a manners manual, perhaps from Europe or another place. And so let's go ahead and look at a couple of these. We'll find these interesting. Forgive me as I look down at my screen here, but let's look at Ben Franklin's. Number 1, temperance. Eat not to dullness, drink not to elevation. Number 2, silence. Speak not but what may benefit others or yourself. Avoid trifling conversation. Number 3, order. Let all your things have their places. Let each part of your business have its time. Let's skip down to number 5, frugality. Make no expense but to do good to others and to yourself. Waste nothing. So you get the idea here that most of Franklin's resolutions have to do with things like his industriousness, sincerity, pursuit of justice, moderation, cleanliness. And we can put all these things under the general rubric of civility or good-naturedness. Okay? Not necessarily anything spiritual or super deep, nothing of a divine or a holy nature, not necessarily any resolutions towards religion per se, although it is interesting that Franklin's 13th resolution is that he might have humility in imitating both Jesus and Socrates. So there you go. Now Washington's I find to be very interesting and perhaps even humorous in a couple of places because of how detailed they are in terms of public comportment. So let's have a look at a few of Washington's resolutions. Here's number 1. Every action done in company or in public ought to be done with some sign of respect to those that are present. And you can almost imagine Washington living up that ideal as a public persona, to live to respect other persons, especially in social situations. Here's number 9. I think this is a hilarious one. Spit not in the fire, nor stoop low before it. Neither put your hands to the flames to warm them, nor set your feet upon the fire, especially if there were meat before it. And so you can almost picture Washington with some of the soldiers gathered around a campfire. As a general, you ought not to be like those lowly soldiers that spit into the fire and put your feet to warm up by the fire, especially if somebody else is cooking meat on that fire. An image that I find to be humorous. 15th resolution of Washington, keep your nails clean and short. Also your hands and your teeth clean without showing any great concern for them. Now that's kind of funny too, because I think most of us realize that Washington didn't have the greatest set of chompers, and he's kind of famous for having his very crude early attempts at dentures in his mouth, and yet here's a resolution to keep the teeth clean but not be overly preoccupied with them. And then finally, here's his last resolution, his 110th, says, labor to keep alive in your breast that little spark of celestial fire called the conscience. That little spark in your chest, in your heart, that is called the conscience. Keep that alive, says George Washington. Not bad. Now going back to Jonathan Edwards, the subject, of course, of our inquiry here, one of the things I mentioned in the second video on the Theological project is the interrelationship between Edwards's various diaries and notebooks. And there is a very clear and symbiotic relationship between the resolutions and the diary itself. In fact, you really can't study the one without also studying the other. And that's because these two documents, the resolutions and the diary, are constantly referencing or cross-referencing the other. And so we can actually see this dynamic sort of unfold before our eyes if we were to hold the two next to each other. They very much do work in tandem. So let me share a little bit about how this relationship works between the two documents. So whenever Edwards writes a resolution, he tends to record the writing of that resolution in his diary. So for instance, he'll say something in his diary like, evening, such and such a date, did this or that, also wrote the 15th resolution or whatever, I'm just making it up, the 65th resolution, whatever it is. He often records the writing of that resolution in his diary. But then, also in his diary, because it's a longer form personal document, he will often go back to previous of his resolutions that he's made and compare himself to his ability to uphold that resolution. And sometimes what we find is that Edwards is disappointed in his own ability to keep up his own personal goals. Of course, the problem with setting these standards for yourself is that none of us can really uphold the standards that we set. And Edwards's goals are certainly very lofty indeed. When you begin to read some of them, as we're going to do in a few moments, you're going to find Edwards setting the bar extraordinarily high, almost as high as he possibly can for himself. He says in one place, for instance, if there was one true Christian on planet Earth, let that be me. And I don't think that's a selfish claim on his part. He's not saying he is the best Christian. He's just setting the ideal. That look, if there was one person that was going to consistently try to live out the ideals of Christianity, it ought to be him. So that's a pretty high goal, right? And so he finds himself disappointing himself, and so in his diaries he will often record the failures of his resolutions, which brings us back to the resolutions. And so what does Edwards do? Well, he tries to fortify himself by writing more resolutions. So if you can't uphold the ones you've already written, hey, why not go back and write a few more? Fortress yourself, buttress yourself, make yourself stronger is kind of the idea here. But that only prompts more failure on the part of Edwards, and he very quickly identifies the problem with this as soon as January of 1723, that this game might not end up so well, because he despairs at one point of even being able to write the kinds of resolutions that are ultimately going to be able to keep himself on the right track. And so as these two documents go back and forth, what we begin to sense is that there is a tension between these two documents. That tension is going to lead Edwards ultimately to a breaking point in August of 1723, and he's eventually going to have to concede that the project has ended in somewhat of a failure. Not a total failure, but in some ways a failure. So he goes on working on the diary for some time, although that project too ends up petering out, and he writes less and less entries into the diary, so much so that by the year 1735 he's maybe doing one entry a year. That's it. They're rather disconnected from the others, and he breaks a hard break with the diary project too. Possibly he got so busy with other pastoral concerns. It is interesting that 1735 is the beginning of that local Northampton revival, which we mentioned in Lecture 1. And so perhaps as he begins to be more consumed with the events of the local revival and then the broader Great Awakening in 1740, perhaps he begins to simply focus less on his own heart and more on the higher duties and callings that God appears to be raising him up to, as his own profile as a pastor gives way to a renowned international revivalist and theologian on all things related to revival. Well, let's get into the resolutions itself. It does begin before Resolution 1 with a preamble that Edwards wrote to himself, and so let's have a look at the preamble here. He says, in his own words, being sensible that I am unable to do anything without God's help, I do humbly entreat him by his grace to enable me to keep these resolutions so far as they are agreeable to his will for Christ's sake. That's the first line, and then the preamble has a second line. Remember to read over these resolutions once a week, Now, some people have noticed, and I think it's worthy to ponder this fact, that the first sentence seems to be relying very heavily on the grace of God to carry him through, to give him the strength and the ability to carry out the resolutions. And so the first statement of the preamble seems to be a dependence upon divine grace, but no sooner does he say that second sentence, sentence 2 in the preamble, says that he ought to remember to read over these resolutions once a week. And some persons have seen a rather strong statement of self-reliance or self-dependence in that second sentence of the preamble, which may be a foreshadowing of the fact that Edwards is essentially going to fail in his ability to keep the resolutions. Now, as I've studied the resolutions, and there's different ways to go about doing this, I've tended to categorize them by theme rather than working through them chronologically. And those would be the two main ways that people have attempted to study the resolutions. Chronologically, of course, makes sense because you could simply follow along the order of his life with his diary and simply look at the resolutions in terms of the order in which he wrote them. But I personally think it's a little bit more helpful to look at them by broader category. I happen to be working on a book project for Hendrickson Publications in which I'm going to be looking at the resolutions in some detail. And I've decided upon 3 basic categories under which to examine the resolutions, and I'll let the cat out of the bag here early and share with you what I'm attempting to do in this book. I look at the resolutions under these 3 broad headings. Number 1, existential resolutions. Those primarily have to do with his purpose in life, keeping his faith strong, pursuing God in terms of holiness, his intellectual pursuit of sanctification as he studies the things of the Word of God. So, of course, existentialism is, well, that's a philosophy that was developed by others. But existentialism, broadly speaking, is the idea that you're aware of your personal existence, you're pursuing deep and real meaning in this world, that your conscience is alive and awake to your interrelationship with other creatures and even with God himself. And so in these headings of resolutions, under existential, we'll be looking primarily at Edwards' own purpose in life. In other words, if Edwards was to ask the question, why did God make me who I am? What am I doing on planet Earth? Why am I alive? What should I be about in this brief life? Then those would be covered under the existential resolutions. Second major category, at least for me, are the ethical resolutions. Of course, these have to do with how should one then live his life. To think of Francis Schaeffer's great book title, How Then Shall We Live? If my purpose is to live for the glory of God, then what does that require of me? What kind of a person should I be? How should I pursue the development of character? What kind of comportment should I have in terms of the way I carry myself as an individual? And particularly, what is my duty in this world? What does God require of me, and what is required of me in terms of social relationships? So my second category is the ethical resolutions. And then third, my third big umbrella category is the eschatological resolutions. So you notice the alliteration there. They each begin with E. Existential, ethical, and eschatological. If you're familiar with the term eschatology from systematic theology, of course, that has to do with the end of all things, the return of Christ. And you may also know that eschatology is sometimes divided into 2 subsections. There's historical eschatology that has to do with the return of Christ, and then there's personal eschatology that has to do with one's own death. What happens to us as an individual when we die. And I think that term is appropriate for these resolutions because Edwards does sometimes mention how the return of Christ ought to prompt him to live, but also to think upon his own death as an individual soul who is mortal and is one day going to go to the grave. So those 3 categories, and what I'd like to do now then is to take you, the viewer, through some samples of each one of these types, and then we'll make some summary observations based on category. So let's first of all look at the existential resolutions, and again we're reminded that these have to do with purpose, faith, and his heart and his mind. So here's resolution number 1. This is the key resolution really, and it sets the frame and the trajectory for all the resolutions. Every other resolution is in some ways a commentary on resolution number 1. And again, remember he's 19 years old when he writes this. He says, "Resolve that I will do whatever I think to be most to God's glory and for my own good, profit and pleasure in the whole of my duration, without any consideration of the time, whether now or never so many myriads of ages hence. Resolve to do whatever I think to be my duty and most for the good and advantage of mankind in general. Resolve to do this whatever difficulties I meet, how many and how great soever." So even in resolution number 1, you actually see all 3 of the categories that I mentioned. There's certainly some resolutions about his purpose here, which he identifies as to live for the glory of God. There's certainly some implications here about his ethical comportment as he talks about living for the good of other human beings. And then there's some eschatological inference here as well when he realizes that the whole of his duration, or the length of his mortal life, is of course limited. Okay, so that's the overarching first resolution. Here's another one. This is resolution 53. Edward says, "Resolved to improve every opportunity when I am in the best and happiest frame of mind, to cast and to venture my soul on the Lord Jesus Christ, to trust and to confide in him, to consecrate myself wholly to him, that from this I may have assurance of my safety, knowing that I confide in my Redeemer." July 8th, 1723. A beautiful resolution, and I am particularly drawn to that phrase where he says to cast and to venture my whole soul on the Lord Jesus Christ. It's almost this idea of, look, you only have one life to live, and at some point you have to make some major decisions about this eternal soul that's being carried around in your mortal body. And to think of Blaise Pascal's his great wager. Remember, Pascal said that life is kind of like a wager. You have to decide how you're going to live, and you're really risking eternity here, because if Christianity is true and you live for the glory of Jesus, then you win everything. But if Christianity turns out to be false and you live for him, then you really haven't lost anything because you've lived for his glory. But the worst possible scenario is for Christianity to be true, but to live as though it's false, in which case you lose everything. And I think Edwards is almost tapping into that kind of a language here, that in a sense, we are risking it all. We're risking everything. We're risking eternity, heaven and hell, the possibility of living either with God forever in heaven, or conversely torture eternally in hell forever. We're risking it all based on what we do with Christ. And so Edwards says here, "I will cast and venture my whole soul on Jesus Christ and consecrate myself entirely to him." And so if Edwards is answering Blaise Pascal's wager here, he certainly does so finding in favor of entrusting his whole mortal life and eternal soul into the good hands of Christ as a Redeemer. Here's another one. This is another existential resolution. This is number 63, and one that many people have tripped up over. It says, "On the supposition that there was never but one individual in the world at any time who was properly a complete Christian in all respects, of a right stamp, having Christianity always shining in its true luster, and appearing excellent and lovely from whatever part and under whatever character viewed, resolved to act just as I would do if I strove with all my might to be that one who should live in my time." Now, some people have looked upon this resolution, and I think they've misunderstood it, because they've read it in the sense that Edwards is actually claiming to be the most ardent pursuer of Jesus Christ in his own time and in his own lifespan. But I don't think that's his point here at all, because of the key phrase at the beginning, "on the supposition that there was never to be but one individual in the world at any time." So Edwards is making a theoretical statement here. He's saying, What if it were the case, theoretically here, that at any given time on planet Earth there was only one true Christian? What if it's true, just theoretically, on the sake of a mental exercise here, a thought experiment, that there was only one real Christian in every generation? Edwards says, well, I'm going to resolve as if I were to live to be that person in my lifetime. So while many have kind of interpreted this as what would seem to be a very arrogant statement on Edwards' part, I actually don't think that's his intention, although I get that it certainly comes across that way. Edwards is saying that even if I have to live a lonely existence, even if there is only one true believer, I'm still going to be that person who truly pursues Jesus Christ, even if nobody else is with me. We kind of think back to the prophet Elijah from the Old Testament, who at one point he almost despairs and says, am I the only one left? And God reminds him, no, I've reserved for myself 7,000 who have not yet bowed the knee to Baal. It's kind of the same idea here. Not that Edwards feels alone, but he's saying I would continue to walk alone, even if I was the only one to pursue Jesus Christ in my own generation. And so if we sum up this category of the existential resolutions, we do find that there are some common themes running throughout them. First of all, the glory of God as the highest end of existence is clearly manifest in these resolutions. And in so, we also see almost some confessional language here. There's a couple of times in which Westminster Shorter Catechism number 1 appears to be on Edwards' thought. There's another time or two where Heidelberg Catechism number 1 about my whole self, body, and soul, in life and in death. That kind of language seems to be evident. And that's certainly likely that Edwards was dwelling on those catechetical famous questions. We do know for a fact that Edwards was trained in the Westminster Shorter Catechism by his father as a child. That the Shorter Catechism was probably the premier confessional teaching of children in the schools at that time, and so it's not surprising that Edwards would reflect that language, although he very rarely in any of his writings quotes from the creeds or the confessional materials, but he does seem to allude that. We appreciate, of course, a language of casting or venturing the soul fully upon Christ in these. And there are a couple of places in the existential resolutions where Edwards makes some promises to himself to study as thoroughly as possible the scripture. So resolutions 2 and 28 are two that are interesting. Now, I mentioned in lecture 2, in fact, the thesis of my second lecture was that basically the whole or the primary means of Edwards' spiritual development is taken up in the writing of his own personal theological project. And I would support that contention here with these two resolutions, number 2 and number 28. Because in resolution number 2, Edwards promises himself that he will devise as many, quote, new contrivances as necessary to pursue the things of the Lord. And in resolution 28, he promises himself to pursue the study of Scripture as ardently as he can. And I think that's why Edwards continued to innovate in his series of notebooks, sometimes abandoning particular projects like the resolutions and the diary, but oftentimes starting new contrivances, new notebooks, new inquiries, and obviously new miscellanies as he carried on that system throughout most of his life. Clearly also in the existential resolutions, we get this idea of striving for the highest possible goals. We certainly cannot fault Edwards for setting the bar too high. Of course, Christ calls us to be holy as God is holy, and yet we do worry for Edwards' sake here that perhaps he's engaging in a project of spiritual rigorism that's going to end up in despondency and despair, and of course some defeat. The good part about setting goals high is, hey, look, we're pursuing the greatest end in the universe, which is Christ. But sometimes we also have to be realistic with ourselves, that we are mortal and we are frail. Now let's move on to the ethical resolutions then. This is the second category. And the ethical resolutions are primarily concerned with such things as his external character. With speech, in particular, the way he talks, there's a number of resolutions about speech. And then also that there's several concerned with duty. So let's look at a couple of examples of these ethical resolutions. Here's number 38. Resolved never to speak anything that is ridiculous or a matter of laughter on the Lord's Day. Sabbath evening, December 23, 1722. Did you hear that? Edwards just said, I'm not going to say anything funny, no jokes, no laughing on Sundays, on the Lord's Day. And you may say to yourself, come on, J.E., you're taking this a little bit too far here. What's the deal with that? But don't forget that the Puritan colonialists, the Reformed Calvinists of New England, were very Sabbatarian in their carrying out of the fourth commandment. The fourth commandment today is probably the one commandment that's neglected most by contemporary evangelicals. But we're talking about a movement here that's basically rooted in Westminsterian confessional faith, in which the Sabbath is still very highly regarded. And so Edwards promises himself here in Resolution 38 that he's not going to let his heart be detracted even to matters of laughter on the Lord's Day. Now you can disagree with that if you want to, but you get the idea of the seriousness that Edwards is going to pursue in his spiritual walk. Here's another one. This is 46. Resolved never to allow the least measure of any fretting or uneasiness at my father or mother. Resolved to suffer no effects of it, so much as the least alteration of speech or motion of the eye, and to be especially careful with it with respect to any of our family. Now there's some real personal stuff happening here, and this is where the diary comes into view, because Edwards is disappointed in having to come back to his father's roof after his time in the Presbyterian Church in New York City. Clearly, Edwards loved his time in New York, and he was sad to have it come to a close. He made some great spiritual relationships. He preached many of his early sermons, and he loved the pastoral ministry in New York. We kind of wonder what might have happened if things had turned out differently, but unfortunately for Edwards' sake, he did have to come back under the home of his strict father, Timothy, and his mother. And so we see here in this resolution, and we can see this pretty clearly in the diary, that he really has to watch his speech when he's around mom and dad, because he still wants to honor the fifth commandment around them. But he realizes his temptation to alter his voice with annoyance, or even to roll the eyes when his parents give him a command that perhaps he was not appreciative of. And so you have to picture here kind of this beautiful irony of one of the great theological minds of the era having to do his chores, having to work out in the field with the scythe, or having to go to feed the hogs out in the barn, or whatever other household chores Edwards may have had to do. Here's one of the greatest thinkers, certainly in American theological history, submitting to the chores and the assignments that his parents give him. And so he has to resolve to himself not to use a sarcastic tone of voice or to roll his eyes when his parents speak to him. Number 56 is an interesting one. Resolve never to give over, nor in the least to slacken my fight with my corruptions, however unsuccessful I may be. Here, Edwards probably again picks up on some confessional language without quoting it. In Westminster Confession, chapter 13, there's this idea that the spiritual nature of the born-again man is at a continual warfare with the flesh. And Edwards uses this language of the fight, or the Westminster continual and irreconcilable warfare in oneself between the man that is filled with the Spirit and still our remaining desires of corruptions, temptations to lust, etc. And so Edwards says, I'm going to fight, no matter how weak I feel, no matter how many times I lose battles to temptation, I'm never going to slacken the fight. And so summing up this ethical category of resolutions, we can say that this category is primarily concerned with strict temperance. Even in terms of food and drink, we have at least two resolutions, number 20 and number 40, that have to do with eating. By all accounts, Edwards was a frail man, tall and thin, as his sisters were. Remember, All 10 sisters were all over 6 feet tall. Edwards, too, was tall and frail. He was never in very good health in his lifetime, but he realized that even his diet affected the way he was able to study with the mind for hours at a time. And Edwards, as a young man, began to experiment with the caloric intake of his diet. And what Edwards realized was sometimes if he would pig out on high-calorie food, then his body would kind of slump off for an hour or two as he went into these digestive periods where he couldn't think and he got tired. You know what it feels like after Thanksgiving. You eat the turkey and it's got that tryptophan in it or whatever it's called, and you feel sluggish for an hour or two, maybe want to take a nap. And so Edwards resolved that he wasn't going to do that. His studies were too important to him over a lifetime, and so he makes resolutions about even monitoring his eating and drinking. The other thing that seems to be pretty common in the ethical resolutions is that Edwards is very aware of the way he comes off with people. If Edwards struggled with his comportment, he was certainly never accused of being gregarious or outgoing. He was a reserved man. Sometimes he could be accused of being cold or unwarm at the very least. Edwards is aware of this, and so at least with his struggle with his outward demeanor, he was aware. And so we see a number of resolutions in which Edwards promises himself to come across as good-naturedly and benevolent when in social company. We almost feel for him that this is his Achilles heel, and he knows it and he's fighting with it, but at the end, he is who he is and he struggles with that. One anecdote here is interesting. When Edwards was offered the presidency of Princeton University later on in life, practically the year before his death, Edwards did take the presidency, he only held it for a couple of months before he died. But even in his letter to the trustees of the College of New Jersey, as it was called, he warns them, look, I'm not a very socially gracious person like the president of a university might have to be. And so he apparently struggled with his comportment, his demeanor, his public persona, his entire life. If it was an Achilles heel, at least we can say he was aware of it, which is probably maybe more than we can say for ourselves at times. We're not always aware of our personal blind spots. And then a final key category in this area is truth in relationship to speech. There are a number of resolutions in which he promises to speak clearly, truthfully, and in what he calls simple verity, which means he will not lie, exaggerate, or stretch the truth in any context. Okay, let's move on then to the final category, and that would be the eschatological resolutions. And here we see a major theme developing about the brevity of life, the unavoidable moment of death that is to come upon all of us, and then Edwards dwells quite a bit on eternity. Now these ones I find to be the most interesting myself, because I love the way that Edwards thinks about the brevity of life as a motive to living fully for the glory of God now. In fact, a couple of occasions he even dwells on hell for a moment to inspire himself to try to live for the glory of God as much as possible. So let's look at a couple of these. Number 7, resolved never to do anything which I should be afraid to do if it were the last hour of my life. So don't do anything, Edwards says. If you were to know, hey, I'm going to die an hour from now, well, certainly don't do anything that you wouldn't do if you knew Jesus were about to return, or if you were about to face your maker and your judge momentarily. Another eschatological resolution, number 17. Resolved that I will live so as I shall wish I had done when I come to die. Kind of awkwardly phrased there. But you get the idea. All of us are probably going to look back on our lives at some point, and many of us are going to have some regrets. I wish I had been more adventurous, or I wish I would have kept my mouth closed, or I wish I would have taken the job in Wichita, or whatever it is. You're going to have some regrets about your life, and Edwards says, no, don't do that. Live right now in the way that you will live so that when you come to die, you'll look back on your life with as little regret as possible. That's a beautiful resolution, isn't it? Number 55, resolve to endeavor to my utmost to act as I can think I should do, again, awkward phrasing, if I had already seen the happiness of hell and eternal torments. Now this is a great one, because you imagine for a moment that God gave you a glimpse of heaven, and you saw its joys and its feasting, and heard its songs, and you tasted the banquet food of that glorious wedding supper of the Lamb. Would that change the way that you lived right now? I'm guessing it probably would. And then contrary-wise, imagine if you had heard the screams of torment in hell, or smelled that burning sulfur, or saw the red-hot fire of the tortures of the damned with your own eyes. Imagine if you had seen those things. Would that cause you to live any differently in regards to personal holiness, or perhaps the way you evangelize the lost? I think the obvious answer to that is yes. So Edward says, live your life now as though you had seen the joys of hell and the suffering of eternal damnation. And so the eschatological resolutions have as common themes throughout this idea of one's own sin, confessing your sin before you come to die, this idea of self-examination, that you're going to examine your soul knowing that it will one day be forever in heaven or hell, the brevity of this mortal life, the surety of death to come, and then the realities of eternity that we shall all face. And so that's a pretty good summary, I would say, or at least I hope it is, of the 70 resolutions. But now we come, as we close, to the question of why he quit writing the resolutions. Well, I suggested that there might be two possibilities to this. One is that he simply saw the canon of the resolutions as just full enough. I mean, how many resolutions do you need? But there are some hints in his writings that the real reason he quit making resolutions, or at least keeping track of his life compared to those resolutions, was that he continued to fail in that regard and to be more dependent on divine grace, which is, of course, a good thing. Hopefully we all come to the point in our lives where we realize that self-effort is not enough, that morality or the Christian life is not ultimately a self-improvement project, but it really is a dependence upon God's Holy Spirit in the work of sanctification. If you happen to go to the RPTS conference on sanctification that was held just recently this fall, it was a wonderful, wonderful conference, and one of the things, the commonalities of all the faculty speakers of RPTS was that sanctification really is a work of God. It truly is a work of the Holy Spirit upon the soul. And sometimes we have to experience the bitterness of frustration in order to truly apprehend the fact that we cannot sanctify ourselves. And even as lofty as some of these goals would seem by Jonathan Edwards, remember, he was only converted in 1721, and he wrote these resolutions in 1722 and 23. Which means that Edwards had a lot of maturing to do. And even as his genius is clearly evident in his early writings, so also we can see that he does have some spiritual maturity yet to go. And so from very early on in his diary, we realize that Edwards is going to be ultimately frustrated by these efforts to make resolutions and to try to keep them. And so we find this on January 20th on the Sabbath day. Note, just a month after he began the project, very early on, he says in his diary, at night, "Last week I was sunk so low that I fear it will be a long time ere I shall be recovered. I fell exceedingly low in the weekly account. I find my heart so deceitful that I am almost discouraged from making any more resolutions." So there it is. He's already feeling the burden of trying to keep them. "Wherein I have been negligent in the past week, and how could I have done better to help the dreadful low estate in which I am sunk?" Now you remember, one of his goals in writing the resolutions was that he would be able to keep track of his spiritual victories and his losses. But here we see that he's already beginning to feel the burden of his soul, of his inability to keep the resolutions. And then finally, and we'll pretty much end up here, there's another hint in his personal narrative which he wrote several years later. I'm thinking it's 1740, but I could be wrong. But either way, he's looking back on his spiritual progress as a young man. A key document that he writes to a younger minister. And he says this, listen to this from the personal narrative. And he's describing the Presbyterian New York City era here. the early pastoral years. He says, quote, "I had an eager thirsting and progress after these things. My longings after it put me upon pursuing and pressing after them. It was my continual strife day and night and my constant inquiry how I should be more holy and live more holily and more becoming of a child of God and a disciple of Christ. I sought an increase in grace of holiness, and that I might live a holy life with vastly more earnestness than ever I sought grace before I had it. I used to be continually examining himself." Here's practically a direct reference to the resolutions, okay? "And studying and contriving for likely ways and means how I should live holily, with far greater diligence and earnestness than ever I pursued anything in my life. But, and here's the key phrase, with too great a dependence on my own strength, which afterwards proved a great damage to me." And so there it is. When he looks back on the Resolutions project, he realizes that he has placed too much emphasis on the self and not nearly enough emphasis on his reliance on the work of the Holy Spirit. So, sometimes people ask me, because they know I'm studying the resolutions and working on a book project about this topic, whether I've written my own resolutions. So far, though I think it's a really cool idea, my answer to that has been no. I haven't written my own resolutions, and I'm not sure that I ever will, because I want to make sure that I'm not making that mistake that Edwards did in depending too much on my own strength and not enough on the work of the Spirit of God. Well, thank you so much for listening to this lecture. I do hope you appreciate and look at the other lectures that preceded it. But for now, I'll sign off and say Pastor Matt here from Gospel Fellowship PCA. Love you lots, and we'll talk to you later.